The best birthday gift I ever received was 4 words: "We never loved you." My grandmother used to say, "The truth always finds its way out." She meant it as a warning, but for me, it turned out to be a door. To understand what happened on October 14th, you have to understand the 9 months before it, what most of my life looked like, really, when I am being honest about it. I am Brielle, a clinical trial coordinator in Boston. I spent my life as the architect of my family's survival, only to realize I was just an asset they intended to liquidate. In that moment, when the mask finally slips, would you have stayed to defend yourself, or would you have realized the door was finally open? Betrayal rarely announces itself with a dramatic flair. Sometimes it is just a red digit on a monitor, a quiet breach of logic in a system built on precision. It was 2 o'clock in the morning in mid-January when the notification hit my encrypted work phone. An unauthorized login attempt. Someone had accessed the Beacon Hill Clinical Trials database using my administrative credentials. As a trial coordinator, my access is not just a professional privilege. It is a legal boundary between medical progress and catastrophic liability. My first thought was a security glitch, a server hiccup from the cold Boston night. I sat at my kitchen table, the blue light of the laptop carving hollows into the shadows of my apartment. Looking back now, I realize my lack of panic was its own kind of tragedy. I had been trained to be the fixer, the one who resolves the error before the alarm sounds. I pulled the log reports, tracing the internet protocol address through the hospital's security firewall. I expected a ping from a different continent, a professional hacker seeking data to sell. Instead, the origin point was a residential router in a quiet suburb 20 minutes north. It was my parents' house. It took me several minutes to process the site of their home network address on my screen. My mother, Heather, had spent the previous weekend visiting me, claiming she missed her daughter's company. She had sat in my home office for 3 hours while I ran errands, just wanting to feel close to my life. She hadn't just sat there. She had waited for me to leave my phone unattended while I showered, long enough to authorize a new device and bypass the 2-factor authentication on my administrative account. I hadn't realized then that closeness was a euphemism for surveillance. She hadn't just looked at my photos, she had mirrored my keystrokes, lifting the digital keys to my professional life. Anger was not my first response. It was a cold, analytical calculation. If I am being honest, I felt a familiar, heavy exhaustion. I knew what she was looking for: access to the restricted patient list for the new aesthetic medicine trial, a way to fast-track her friends into a program they did not qualify for. Some betrayals do not arrive with a shout. They arrive as a notification on a cold screen. That is when I realized some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I did not call her. I did not demand an explanation that I knew would be wrapped in a lie about just being curious. Instead, I spent the next 3 hours quietly rebuilding my defenses. I established a new multi-factor authentication protocol that required a physical security key I kept on my person. I began a private ledger, documenting every unauthorized attempt to breach my clinical portal. I was no longer just managing their lives. I was building an evidence file. I was starting to understand that to protect my future, I had to stop treating my family like a sanctuary and start treating them like a threat. I was the engine that powered their entire lives. For 29 years, I had occupied a position that was less like a family member and more like a high-functioning infrastructure. My father, Todd, required a level of maintenance that would have overwhelmed a professional nursing staff. Following his surgery 3 years ago, I didn't just help him recover. I designed his survival. I was the one who tracked his blood pressure readings every 4 hours, who synchronized his 6 different prescriptions to avoid dangerous interactions, and who spent my lunch breaks on the phone with providers, ensuring his coverage remained active. He lived in a house of cards, and I was the one holding my breath to keep the wind from blowing. My mother, Heather, operated on a different frequency of entitlement. To her, my clinical expertise was not a hard-earned professional achievement, but a family asset she was entitled to leverage. I handled her insurance claims, negotiated her out-of-network bills, and managed the digital clutter of her social life. Looking back now, I realized I had fallen into the service identity trap, a psychological state where you begin to view your own exhaustion as a metric of your worth. I believed that if I were useful enough, I would finally be essential enough to be loved. It was a subscription where I was the only one footing the bill, and the price was my own autonomy. I remember a Tuesday evening 14 months ago. I had just completed a grueling 14-hour shift at the hospital, managing 3 separate trial cohorts. I went to their house to drop off my father's medication refills, my head throbbing with a tension headache. My mother was in the kitchen, complaining about a password lockout on her favorite luxury retail site. I sat at the table, my coffee going cold, resetting her account while she spoke over me about the importance of her upcoming charity lunch. She didn't ask if I had eaten. She didn't notice the shadows under my eyes. To her, I was simply the furnace keeping the room warm. If I am being honest, I think that was the night the first crack formed in the foundation. I realized that I was providing a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and I was starting to run out of fuel. At the time, I didn't realize that people who depend on you for warmth will often burn you to stay comfortable if the wood runs out. I was tired of being the silent investor in their version of family, receiving 0 returns on an investment that was costing me everything. The furnace was still burning, but I was finally looking for the off switch. My mother didn't want my love, she wanted my signature. Heather arrived at the hospital on a Wednesday in August, projecting a type of social certainty that makes barriers seem like suggestion. She brought lunch, a surprise meant to demonstrate her devotion, though I noticed her scanning the biometric reader on my office door before she even sat down. In my world, an identity badge is a skeleton key. It provides the access that defines a clinical career. I was called away to verify a cryo shipment for less than 5 minutes, leaving my credentials on my desk. When she left, she was smiling the specific satisfied curve of someone who had just acquired an asset. 2 hours later, my badge was gone. I spent 40 minutes retracing my steps in the sterile quiet of the ward, but the actual cost of her visit arrived the following morning at 9:15 a.m. The investigational drug services manager from the hospital in Longwood was on the line, his voice a cold, professional warning. He was flagging an unauthorized prescription for an experimental aesthetic peptide, a high-stakes drug currently locked under clinical trial protocols. The order bore my digital signature and was validated by my missing badge serial number. By 11:30 a.m., I was no longer an architect of medical progress. I was a subject of interest. I was placed on immediate administrative suspension, a procedural frost that blocked me from my lab and my data. The Board of Inquiry launched a formal investigation, placing the $120,000 research grant I had spent 2 years securing at extreme risk. I realized then that my mother didn't want my success. She wanted my access. My career was just a key she thought she had the right to copy. If I'm being honest, the humiliation was less painful than the clarity. At the time, I didn't realize that my father was the one who had leaked my private clinical passwords to her just to avoid an argument, but the pattern was starting to emerge from the fog. This was the price of being the useful daughter. My integrity was simply a line of credit they felt entitled to draw upon. I sat in my apartment that evening, the clinical silence of the city feeling like an indictment. It took me years to understand that some forms of dependence are actually a slow-motion theft. Looking back now, I see that her lunch visit wasn't an act of affection, it was a reconnaissance mission. The $120,000 wasn't just a number, it was the value of the trust I had built, a trust she was willing to liquidate for a favor to a social rival. I didn't call her to scream. I didn't demand the badge back. Anger is a luxury when you are fighting for your professional life. I opened my laptop and began drafting a response that was transactional, precise, and final. I was starting to realize that the only way to save my career was to professionally divorce the people who had turned it into a crime scene. Silence in my father's house was a curated commodity. I drove to their home on a Thursday evening, not as a daughter seeking comfort, but as an investigator presenting a closing argument. Todd was in his armchair, the blue flicker of the television reflecting in his glasses, a picture of fragile, managed health that I had meticulously maintained for him over 3 years. I didn't sit down. I stood in the doorway and placed the hospital's internal audit report on the mahogany side table, right next to the blood pressure monitor I had bought for him. I asked him, without inflection, how my mother had obtained the administrative passwords to my clinical portal. He didn't look at me. He simply stared at the screen and admitted he gave them to her because it was easier than hearing her complain. The admission was delivered with a shrug, a casual betrayal meant to maintain his personal equilibrium. Looking back now, I realized that Todd's silence was never a lack of opinion. It was a strategic choice. He had been trading my professional safety for his own comfort for years, treating my career as a buffer between him and my mother's insatiable social needs. But as I sat with the logs in the quiet of my apartment later that night, I found a deeper layer of complicity. My father hadn't just enabled Heather's theft. He had been a primary beneficiary of the breach. He used my credentials to manipulate the enrollment logs, leveraging my status as a coordinator to list himself as a priority staff exception for an experimental treatment he didn't legally qualify for. He had effectively stolen medical access from patients who were actually enrolled in the study, people whose lives truly depended on that data. It took me years to understand that the enabler is often more dangerous than the aggressor. My mother was a visible storm, but my father was the one who quietly removed the roof so the rain could get in. He wasn't intentionally cruel, but he was fundamentally, pathologically selfish. He didn't love me, he just loved the peace I bought him with my silence. I had been the silent investor in his health, footing the bill for a quality of life he was willing to acquire through fraud. If I am being honest, the sight of him flinching when I mentioned the medical ethics board was the first time I felt a sense of distance. At the time, I didn't realize that my father was just as comfortable using me as my mother was. He simply preferred to do it from the shadows. This was the middle path of a man who values his own peace over his daughter's future, a luxury he had overdrafted for decades. I left him in the dark with his television and his stolen health. I was no longer a daughter protecting a parent. I was a clinical professional documenting a total system failure. On the Monday before my birthday, I sat before the Institutional Review Board, the IRB, and submitted a 40-page dossier. It was not a plea for mercy, it was a professional divorce. Every unauthorized internet protocol login, every forged signature, and the logs from my father's fraudulent cardiac care were laid out in chronological, undeniable order. Looking back now, I realize I wasn't just saving my career, I was finally clearing my balance sheet. The final audit took place on October 14th, at my 30th birthday dinner in Beacon Hill. I had invited 30 guests, my mentors, lead researchers, and the very members of the board currently investigating my license. My mother, Heather, arrived in burgundy silk, assuming her presence at the table would act as a social shield. She didn't mention that the lavish 5-course meal was being charged to a high-limit credit card she had fraudulently opened in my name after she had used her unauthorized access to my home office to freeze my credit monitoring alerts for 14 days. She didn't realize the room was full of witnesses trained to spot a breach of protocol. At 8:41 p.m., the mask finally fell. Heather stood up to deliver a toast, her voice tight with the fear of losing the access she had weaponized for years. "We never really loved you, Brielle," she said, the words cutting through the sound of expensive crystal like a surgical blade. "You were just the only thing we ever produced that was actually useful." The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. In the high-status circles of Boston, reputation is a fragile currency, and Heather had just declared herself bankrupt. This was reputational contagion in its purest form, the moment my colleagues and mentors saw the parasite for what it was. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I simply set down my glass, stood up, and looked at the 30 people who now knew the truth. I didn't need to violate HIPAA by sharing his medical records. I simply presented the undeniable evidence of the identity theft and financial fraud they had committed using my professional credentials. "Thank you for the honesty," I said. I picked up my jacket and walked through the open door, leaving the social wreckage behind. At the threshold, I turned back one last time and added, "The process server should be arriving at your house at 8 a.m. tomorrow, Heather. Make sure you're dressed for it." Heather thought she was taking my dignity. She didn't realize she was signing her own social death warrant. I drank my coffee while it was still hot. I sit in my apartment on Olive Way, watching the gray-green Seattle light shift across the floorboards. It is a Tuesday morning in November, and the city is exactly what I needed it to be: quiet. For the first time in my adult life, I am not on call for someone else's crisis. The furnace clicked on a few minutes ago, a soft, mechanical hum that doesn't require my attention. I didn't have to check the settings. I didn't have to worry if the fuel was low. I just sat here and let the room get warm. Looking back now, I realized that I had spent 30 years as a functional heart for a family that didn't have its own pulse. I was the infrastructure of their existence, the invisible labor that made their entitlement look like a natural law. In the high status circles of Boston, we were the perfect portrait, but I was the only one holding the frame. If I am being honest, the transition to this new city wasn't an explosion. It was a slow, deliberate powering down of a system that had been overclocked for 3 decades. I spent years trapped in the service identity trap, a psychological loop where you believe your utility is your only path to belonging. I thought that if I were useful enough, I would finally be essential enough to be loved. I treated my family like a clinical trial where I was the only participant and they were the adverse effects. I monitored the variables with a clinical intensity, the blood pressure readings, the insurance renewals, the social reputations, thinking I could engineer a successful outcome. But you cannot buy a seat at the table with the very labor that makes the table possible. At the time, I didn't realize that my father's silence was a form of professional theft. Todd didn't just let my mother steal my badge. He let her steal the peace of mind I had worked 2 years to earn. His middle path wasn't a choice for harmony. It was a strategic withdrawal of support that left me exposed to a board of inquiry and a potential loss of my professional life. He valued the convenience of his managed health more than the integrity of my career. He was comfortable using my professional network to jump the treatment queue, effectively stealing medical access from patients who actually qualified for the data. That realization was the final data point I needed to close the file. Some people will tell you that family is a bond that overrides professional ethics or personal safety. They will say that you owe your parents a debt that can never be fully amortized. But I have learned that some debts are predatory. I had been the silent investor in a household that was fundamentally insolvent. When Heather stood up at that party and said those 4 words, she wasn't taking anything from me. She was performing a final audit. She was admitting that the love I had been trying to earn didn't exist in their ledger. She gave me the one thing I couldn't provide for myself, the absolute documented truth. The 53 missed calls on my phone aren't an expression of grief. They are a panic response to a system failure. My father had to spend 90 minutes on hold just to reset a password I had maintained for years, only to find he'd missed his insurance renewal deadline. Meanwhile, my mother was removed from her charity boards because her reputation was no longer an asset I was willing to polish. Watching their functional collapse from 3,000 miles away isn't about revenge. It is about accounting. It is the moment the parasite realizes it has killed the host and has nowhere else to go. I am building a new life here, one drawer at a time. I lead a new account now, a foundation for patient advocacy. I am helping people get the medical access they deserve, not the kind my father tried to steal. My career is no longer a key for my mother to copy. It is a boundary I protect with clinical precision. I still track variables, but now they are mine. I still manage systems, but now they are productive. To those of you listening who feel like you are the only thing keeping your world from falling apart, the ones who always have a cold cup of coffee on the desk because you were too busy resetting someone else's life, I have a message for you. You are not a furnace. You are not a service. You are a person with a finite amount of fuel, and you have every right to stop burning for people who wouldn't even offer you a blanket in the cold. Walking through the open door isn't a betrayal of them. It is a preservation of you. Looking back, that birthday dinner was the most successful event I ever planned. It provided 30 witnesses, a clear deposition, and a permanent exit strategy. The silence that followed was the first time I felt truly safe. Some doors are meant to be walked through alone. And once you are on the other side, you don't have to look back. You just have to keep moving toward the light. Have you ever reached a point where you realized your kindness was being treated as a resource to be mined rather than a gift to be cherished? What was the moment you decided to finally close the door? If this story resonated with you, I would really like to hear your perspective in the comments below.